Okay. Thank you everybody for coming. I do want to open up by acknowledging that we are holding this event here on the traditional territories of the people of the Treaty 7 region of Southern Alberta, which includes the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprising the Siksika, Piikani, and Kainai First Nations, as well as the Tsuut'ina First Nation and the Stoney Nakoda, including the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Wesley First Nations, and that this is also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta Region 3. Thank you everybody for coming to this first in-person precision health seminar. I'm quite delighted to see everyone and also delighted to be introducing our speaker, Dr. Lee Hood. So Dr. Hood is a classic slacker case. I should start there. A person who really has issues with motivation. So he received an MD degree from this forgettable institution on the East Coast called Johns Hopkins University, before finishing that off with a PhD from another forgettable institution down in California called Caltech. He was a professor at Caltech for 22 years. Was the co-founder and chairman of the first cross-disciplinary biology department at the University of Washington, where he was for 8 years. He then became the co-founder and president of the Institute for Systems Biology for 18 years, which was the first organization that really promoted the systems biology perspective. He, continuing this sort of slacker MO, he is now also a member of 3 different US national academies, the Academy of Science, Medicine, and Engineering. And is made impact in a number of ways, but very notably in his work developing an automated DNA sequencing system, which became integral to the Human Genome Project. More recently, he's continued to kind of push this movement towards data-driven medicine throughout the 21st century. He's done this in a variety of different ways, both within sort of academic type institutions and through a number of different other innovative ventures, including co-founding at least 17 different biotech companies, I believe. You can correct me if I've got the number wrong. He's currently remains on the faculty at the Institute for Systems Biology and is now the CEO of Phenome Health, which is a nonprofit organization that is continuing to drive the emergence of precision population health. And as I promised to him and to all of you, I will get out of the way as soon as I possibly can, and that's what I'll do here. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Hood.
Well, it's a pleasure to speak to an audience that for the most part probably agrees with much of what I'm going to say. It is very rare in my experience. I do that, I have to say. So I'm going to tell you a story today about how I came to think about starting this second genome project, which I call Beyond the Human Genome, which proposes over a 10-year period to analyze from a genome and phenome point of view, 1 million people and create a demonstration project that is going to compellingly transform our understanding of the quality of healthcare and the cost of healthcare. We'll make dramatic improvements in both. And the outcome is going to be healthcare in the 10 to 15 year period is going to be driven by wellness and prevention and not by disease. So I'll try and convince you that that is the case. Now, this obviously is an enormously ambitious project, and it has a long-term objective and a short-term objective. And the long-term is to get the federal government to fund us for this 1 million person project. And I would say we have a fair to middling chance of doing that, although, as you might expect, the short-term objective is actually to take a data-driven approach to major healthcare challenges today, and in very short period of time, transform our understanding of diabetes and long COVID. Those are the first two we've chosen. And for this, we can get industrial funding that will get us started within the next 3 to 6 months or so. So we have short-term objectives to get going, and we have long-term objectives to change the whole world. So I promised you a story. So I'm going to start with my first serious academic position at Caltech in 1970, when I went there and was sitting down and thinking about, as a young assistant professor, what I would like to do. And I decided two things. I had a spectacular faculty mentor for my PhD, Bill Dreyer, who gave me two dictums. One dictum was, always practice biology at the leading edge because it's more fun there. And the second dictum was, if you really want to fundamentally change a discipline, invent a new technology that gives you a new window into looking at the data of that system. So I decided I would try and do both. I had been a molecular immunologist for 10 years at that time, and continued that on for another 20 years. And it was an enormously exciting walk down biology, and we won't talk about that at all, except to say the problems of molecular immunology gave me the insight for what technologies we should be interested in developing. And of course, the second interest was to get embedded in technology development, and I'll talk considerably more about that. Now, I was really interested in human biology from the time I was 6 years old, for a lot of different reasons, which we won't go into here. But in thinking about human biology and where I'd go as a young assistant professor in 1970, I decided that medicine and biology at that time were very much like the parable of the elephant and the six blind men, each feeling a different part of the elephant and declaring it's a stump or a wing or a staff, whatever. And of course, what they were doing two things. One, they were only looking at the outside of the elephant, right? And two, they weren't integrating any of their views together at all. It was an isolated little bit in piece. And that really got me thinking at that time about the deficiencies in that were illustrated by that parable. And I'm going to put them in a slightly more contemporary context now than I thought about them at the time, but I did think about these three things. So one was the realization that it really was important to generate a lot of data on individuals. And in thinking about it, it wasn't just to generate data on the outside of the elephant, it was to generate it from the inside. And where would you generate? How could you generate data from the inside apart from imaging? Well, the obvious idea was the blood, because it bathes all organs. All organs secrete molecules into the blood. And if they're organ specific, which all organs have organ specific blood proteins, you can use those proteins, we found later, to be able to infer what's happening with all the major organ systems inside the elephant. And of course, the third thing that was missing, as I hinted earlier, is the idea that you had to take a systems approach and put all these data together and integrate them. So you had a reconstruction of the complexity of the human being. And in doing that integrative reconstruction, you gain brand new insights into what was actually going on. And it was in 1973 that I read this book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions by Thomas Kuhn. And it's absolutely a classic book. It takes discoveries in physics and shows what it takes to initiate a paradigm change and to achieve a paradigm change. And of course, our educational system today is utterly deplorable for initiating paradigm changes because we don't teach students to think outside the box. And that's the first thing you have to be able to do if you're really going to change how we think about science and everything. Well, I had the good fortune to be involved in 7 different paradigm changes. I'm going to run through them quickly because they really set the framework for how I think about contemporary healthcare, while at the same time solving a lot of problems of complexity, okay? So the first paradigm change I got involved with was this idea of bringing engineering to biology. And I developed a series at Caltech of 4 different instruments that could synthesize and sequence genes and DNA. And then later I developed another instrument using inkjet technology that can synthesize DNA and DNA arrays at extremely rapid rates that's used today by Agilent. And then finally, we invented the nanostring technology that is now used so broadly for spatial biology. It was basically a single molecule DNA and RNA analysis technique. And the important point was that for each of those instruments, I started a company that was key in translating knowledge into useful output for society. So Applied Biosystems did the first 4 instruments. And then we started a company called Rosetta that made key additional improvements in the inkjet technology before Agilent took it over. And then finally, we started NanoString with the spatial biology, what's ended up to be spatial biology. Now, what is really interesting about technology is it turns out to be integrative in interesting ways, just like biology is. And what the first 4 instruments we developed gave us the ability to do, and we did, and it transformed biology in really powerful ways, is we could take 200 times less material proteins and get long sequences from it. We could use the DNA synthesizer to make degenerate oligonucleotides to clone the gene. We could use the DNA sequencer to analyze the gene that we got from the germline as well. And then finally, you could use the peptide synthesizer to make epitopes. But the point is, this integrated facility gave us an enormous ability to open up whole fields of new biology. So we did about 25 different molecules where we converted protein sequences into genes and changed that many different fields. And one example is we sequenced the molecule called erythropoietin in collaboration with Amgen, a company that I helped co-found. And they used that to clone what was biotechnology's first billion-dollar protein drug company. It absolutely transformed how pharma thought about drugs. In the past, they'd only thought about small molecules as drugs. What was then true is, with the automated DNA sequencer, I got invited to the first meeting ever held on the Human Genome Project. 12 of us in the spring of '85 went to Santa Cruz and debated about whether it was good or bad, and came to 2 conclusions. 1, it was feasible, though hard at that time. And 2, we were split 6-6 on whether it was a good idea. And those against it were fanatically against it because they were convinced big science would destroy small science. And it turned out to be utterly incorrect. The Genome Project opened up so much new biology, it was unbelievable. But from my point of view, what the Genome Project did that really was transformational is it gave us access to human genetic variability and the ability to correlate it with wellness and disease phenotypes. And we'll talk more about that at a later point in time. My lab became enormously big, mostly because I brought in all these different types of technologists. And in the late 80s, I got that idea that, and I went to the president at Caltech and said, look, I'd like to start an applied department of biology where the focus is in bringing all the new modern technologies that biology is going to need in as faculty members, so I wouldn't have to have an enormously big group. And everybody at biology loved the idea except for the biologists. And I'll leave it to you to figure out why they vetoed it. So Bill Gates made it possible to go to the University of Washington. And in fact, to set up in 1992, the first cross-disciplinary department. And I'll tell you, it was spectacularly successful. We developed utterly key technology for genomics and proteomics and cell biology. And I could define all of these different things. But what I'd really wanted to do in going to the University of Washington was to create the cross-disciplinary framework and build on top of it systems biology. And I found it utterly impossible to build the systems biology part because of petty bureaucracies of a big state university. And I could give you 10 classic examples, but I won't. So in 2000, I said, I'm going to get out here and go someplace where I can really do systems biology. I resigned and started the Institute for Systems Biology in 2000. And then that was enormously successful in applying a systems approach, both to biology and the disease. And what do we mean by a systems approach? It's global, it's holistic, it's integrative, it's big data, and it relies on network biology to translate individual data points into organized, coherent beginning of the understanding of mechanistic biology and so forth. And all of those things were very successfully developed. But then in the early 2000s, I applied systems thinking to medicine and came up with this idea that it should be predictive, preventive, personalized, and participatory. We called that P4 medicine. And that represented two different worlds. Wellness, then entirely ignored by healthcare, almost entirely ignored today by healthcare, and disease. And those were the two polar opposites. And we'll come back to discussing that again. Now, what the realization of P4 medicine made me aware of was the enormous opportunities that were possible in developing technologies and strategies that would bring to medicine the strongest points of systems thinking. And I put in a whole flood of applications to NIH, and it was the most devastating, disappointing experience of my life because it was a lot of small people making infinite little excuses about things. So I really got fed up with federal funding, and I decided what I would do is I would find a small compliant nation, and I would go out and persuade them that we would build them a systems biology institute in return for giving us $100 million over 5 years. And that sounds a bit audacious, but I was really encouraged by the first 4 possibilities I went to: Israel, Ireland, Alberta, and South Korea. And for very different reasons, things almost worked, but didn't quite work. And then the 5th possibility that came up through PricewaterhouseCoopers. I had a good friend at the very top there. He said, look, I hear you're pitching this thing. I'll introduce you to the Secretary of Economy at the state of Luxembourg, and he's looking to diversify their economy from a 90% dependence on finance. So I said, great. And at the end of a 45-minute conversation with him, he said, okay, you've convinced me. What do you need? And I said, how much are you willing to give me? And he said, ask for what you need. So I asked for 100 million over 5 years, and we got it, and we started it. And that's what made possible the next stage. And I'm not going to go into all the things we did, but it was a whole laundry list of very nice things. But it made it possible in 2013 for us to think for the first time about precision population health. And we did it in 2013 with 100 friends, where we did genome and phenome analyses. And really, it was spectacular results. And then in 2014, we started a company called Aerovale, where we accumulated 5,000 individuals with longitudinal data clouds over a 4-year period. And those are the data that we'll talk about in enormous detail, because they are the proof of principle that precision population health is going to work for wellness and prevention. And we'll return to that. And then in the next journey in my career is the head of a very large healthcare system in Seattle approached me, Providence, and said, would you like to become our scientific officer? And I decided then to take Aerovale and multiply it by 200 and start pushing a 1 million person project. So I said, yes, this is the ideal possible place to go. And it was an ideal place to go for 5 years and figure out how to do it. Getting Providence to really buy into this project was next to impossible for a lot of really interesting reasons. So in this past year, I resigned and started a new organization to analyze what's going on called Phenome Health. And that's what I'm going to talk about here in some detail. So what lessons did I learn? One, there was enormous change that each of these paradigm changes introduced into biology. So paradigm changes really make a difference. And two, there was skepticism for all of these things. I remember Watson came to me about 2000. Well, no, it was about late 1990s, and said, why are you putting all this money and trouble and time in sequencing? And, I explained to him my vision of population health as I understood it at that time, totally unconvinced. And Watson just said, well, you realize they're grad students and they can sequence all the DNA we'll ever need. And he said, besides, there are 3 billion people in China, and if they each only sequence 3 nucleotides, we'd have the whole genome done. So it's pretty hard to argue with those kinds of arguments, I must say. But anyway, a lot of skepticism. But the most fundamental point is this one. If you have a new idea, you need a new organization to achieve it. You can never birth innovative new ideas out of old organizations because their bureaucracies are honed by the past and can't begin to even deal with their own futures, let alone really new ideas. And that's been true of every one of the 7 things I've talked about here. Each has had an independent new kind of start. And of course, the idea of determined optimism and never giving up is really key. But, how do you know when you've been successful? Well, when you've been successful when you can really achieve your end goal, and you can argue about just exactly what that is. But you also know you've been successful when you start persuading the skeptics. And for example, with the Genome Project, we've seen most of the skeptics turn around, but not all. There are still a few out there that say it really hasn't done all the things it promised. So what about to Beyond the Human Genome, this second genome project that I talked about. As you know, the first genome project took 13 years to do one sequence. So we proposed to do 1 million sequences in 10 years, plus their longitudinal phenomes. And of course, I think what is really critical for that is we also, over a 10-year period, want to build the infrastructure that's necessary for making this possible. And we're well along to doing that now. So the idea is to go to the federal government and ask them for $10 billion or so. We'd like to convert these data into actionable possibilities. There'll be so many that we'll have to use AI to deliver them to physicians. We're talking to Google about that possibility. And we're going to be seeking industrial support to get us started earlier and everything. And the really critical thing we've done in this early period at Phenome Health, and I'll show you this later, is we put together the internal partners we'll need to be able to carry out this ambitious project. I think we have everything we need to do. And why is it called Beyond the Human Genome? It's because the longitudinal phenome is beyond the genome. Of all the genome projects that are out there, with one exception, none of them are practicing phenomics. And that's those in the UK, that's those in Mexico, that's those in a whole variety, and the US. The All of Us program is essentially a genomics research project, basically. So anyway, the genome, as you know well, is the source code for human development, and it's invariant apart from cancer across time. But the phenome is the conjunction of three things. It's the conjunction of your behavior, your environment, and your genome. And those three things impinge on you every second of your life. And they manifest themselves as your appearance at that point in time. So across your life, you have an infinitude of phenomes. And of course, we'll be assaying phenomes by three things: blood analytes, the gut microbiome, and digital health. We'll talk in some detail about those kinds of things. So the genome with one genome, the second genome project with 1 million genomes and 1 million phenomes. And we hope to catch humans both in their normal context and in their disease context across the entire range from birth to death. And we have to begin with a narrow focused start, but that is the long-term ambition. So the real vision then is that we'll be able for each individual to measure your health trajectory and optimize it, and to do it for brain health as well as body health. And I'll argue all the major projects have ignored brain health almost completely. And I'm only going to talk about one aspect of what we'll do in brain health. So there are three distinct stages of health in your health trajectory: wellness, the transition from wellness to disease, and then progression and resolution of disease, either in death or transfer back to wellness. And we, with precision medicine, have to be able to deal with each of those three things. And in fact, if we can really deal effectively with 1 and 2, we have to worry less and less about disease in the future. And that is exactly my proposal. And what I'll tell you is each of you probably represents 10 to 20% of the wellness you really could manifest if we optimized it for you. And the other thing is, we're going to extend its length by, in the future, being able to take each of these transitions and reverse them before you ever get to disease. So we'll maintain individuals in a state of wellness and move them out into their 90s or 100s, mentally alert and physically capable. So that's absolutely a fundamental transformation. And I'll argue this is the largest paradigm change in the history of medicine by far. And you all are going to be participating in this kind of thing. And I can't imagine a more exciting thing for a young individual to be able to do. We have a proof of principle for this precision medicine. Airvale, we have 5,000 individuals with their longitudinal data clouds over up to 4 years. And with brain health, we're collaborating with Michael Merzenich and his company called Posit, which has the ability to make about 40 brain digital measurements that assess 25 different elements of cognitive ability in human beings. And I'm going to talk more about that a little bit later, but not go into it in enormous detail. But let me go into the Airvale data, because this is, and I'm going to go through it very quickly, but you'll have papers you can go read if you want to see in as much detail as you'd like what it's all about. So we did in Airvale the whole genome sequence. We did longitudinal analyses of blood analytes, clinical chemistries, proteins, and metabolites, 1,200 of them. We did the gut microbiome. Again, we did both of those two things twice a year. We did digital health with Fitbits and other kinds of measurements. And those generated for each individual data that, when analyzed, led to actionable possibilities. And the list of actionable possibilities and the priorities of them were unique for each individual. We had coaches that delivered them very successfully to the individuals, and it worked absolutely beautifully. So let me tell you about what we've done exactly with the Airvale data. So one of the first things we did was to take the 6 different data types and ask, are there statistical correlations of a data bit in one type with data bits in either of the other 5 types? We found 3,500 of these correlations after multiple hypothesis testing and so forth. And we looked through those to find intriguing correlations that sent us to the literature for confirmation. And those led to about 200 actionable possibilities that we could use to improve wellness or avoid disease, okay? And we call this scientific or quantitative wellness. With the Million Person Project, my prediction is we'll have more than 10,000 actionable possibilities, and that's why we need AI to deliver them. The second thing that was really spectacular was, because we had people from 21 to 93, we could bin them into 10-year categories. And we showed in a beautiful way that the ability to control the expression of the 3 classes of blood analytes decayed in a linear proportion as you got older. And without getting into any of the details, we could convert that into an algorithm that allowed us for each individual to determine your biological age. That is, the age your body said you were, as opposed to the age your birthday said you were. And the idea is the lower your biological age is relative to your birthday, the more healthy you're aging. So we showed in Airvale, for every year the Airvale people stayed in the program, men lost a year per year of biological age, women lost 1.5 years per year. We showed for 40 diseases in Airvale, mostly minor kinds of things, every single individual in those diseases was well above their biological age, with diabetes being far the worst. The average for 300 people was 6 years above their biological age. We looked at 2 people for very severe COVID. They were more than 20 years above their biological age. And what this means is we have a metric for wellness, and we're going to use this metric to measure everyone and follow their biological age throughout the million-person project. And that's what you can think about doing in programs you'll run as well. A third thing that we did was to take 54 polygenic scores and convert them into genetic risk scores for the 5,000 individuals. Easily do that because we had whole genome sequence. And we bin them into 5 categories from very low to very high risk with 3 in between. And then what we did was to take the 1,000 blood analytes and in each case, look at the correlations against genetic risk for the 54 diseases. And what we found in every single case were unique collections of analytes that linearly increased or decreased with increasing genetic risk. And without going into detail, that gives you insight into disease mechanisms and insight into possible therapies you can use in dealing with these disease mechanisms. But at the very least, it tells you who the high-risk people are that we can watch very closely for the earliest transition and reverse them if it's possible at that time. Now, the really key observation from the area of prevention was this last observation, and that was 167 out of the 5,000 individuals showed wellness to disease transitions for essentially all major chronic diseases. We took 10 individuals that transitioned to various kinds of cancer, and we looked at the blood draws prior to clinical diagnosis and showed in every case there were protein analytes that were way off scale that marked a transition anywhere from 5 years to 2 years before the actual clinical diagnosis. So the hope in the future for chronic diseases is we can do early diagnosis, and we can, with clinical academics and pharma, figure out therapies that can reverse the disease before it ever manifests itself clinically. And we have done this. We're beginning to test this with Alzheimer's now, and it looks really very, very promising. The final observation that we've made is we are able to show now that we can, from blood metabolites, do a calculation that determines your BMI. And this is generally done by height and weight kinds of things. This is infinitely more accurate, and it's more accurate in its responsiveness to changes in the diet. So this is the second metric we're going to be using on all of the patients that helps you follow wellness in exactly the same way. So there are really two complementary types of wellness, and it's important you really understand this point. So one is classical. It's what everybody does. It's diet and weight and exercise and stress and sleep and all of those kind of things. And those are important, don't get me wrong. But what people fail to do today in assessing those should be improved is they give a global, this works for everybody kind of thing. It isn't individualized. What the second kind of wellness does, data-driven wellness, is gives us actionable possibilities from genome, from phenome, and from the integration of different data types. And among those are deep insights in how to personalize each of the conventional aspects of wellness. And in fact, there are at least 2 companies out there that are doing this with the gut microbiome to optimize your diet with regards to diabetes and things like this. There's a company called Zoe that you should go look at. It's really, they're doing very interesting kinds of things. But the really important part is the data-driven transforms how we deal with traditional wellness. So you need both in an integrative manner, and what 99% of the wellness programs are is just the first more traditional type. Now, let me say another word about brain health here, because this is the ability to use digital measurements to measure the 25 cognitive features. And what Merzenich showed in his classic work that got him the Kevley Prize was that in human development, normally cognition rises to a maximum in your mid-30s. Thereafter, it declines in everyone virtually until it moves to a very low scale later on in life. But what he demonstrated is he was able to take 80-year-olds, and with this digital management diagnosis and digital training, he was able to move 80-year-olds back to where they would have been in their mid-30s. And his whole point, what he won the Kevley Prize for, is the brain is plastic. And this proves it beautifully. So if you're worried about cognition, you know things you can absolutely do now. And let me just say, these cognitive features are really powerful in dealing with common neurologic diseases like depression, like early Alzheimer's and other neurodegenerative diseases. They've had some remarkable successes with traumatic TBI, traumatic brain injuries and stuff from football and concussions and things like that. So I think this brain health is going to be one of two major things we're going to do that are going to be really transformational. And it's something you're all going to want to think seriously about. Metabolic health, diversity is king. We all know that. What we've done are some really interesting things. One, we've shown beautifully that you can measure 11 metabolites in the blood, and from it get a very accurate estimate of your gut diversity. And this is really important because it gives us a way to follow gut health, okay? And it's also important because for any people you have blood samples on in the past, you can go back and look at their microbiome diversity beautifully. But the other point that is really interesting is we recently had a paper published showing that the gut microbiome determines in a major way how effectively an individual can use statins. And the wrong gut microbiome will enormously increase the ability of a statin to reduce LDL cholesterol, which is what you want, right? It enormously increases the possibility of its major side effect, diabetes. So what you have to do is to be able to titrate your gut microbiome where you get the optimal reduction in activity without the onset of diabetes. It's going to be true for all drugs. We're testing a whole series of different drugs at this point in time. And the other point, of course, the gut-brain axis is a major health axis that is really critically important to do integrations on, because again, they're going to lead to an enormous number of actionable possibilities. And finally, a study we did with 9,000 individuals, 60 years through 80 plus years old, was to look at the nature of their gut microbiomes across this 20, 30-year period or so. And in 20-year-olds, you have a core taxa of microbiomes. And what we were able to show in people that were healthy, you lost the core microbiome, but what you did is uniquely differentiated a singularly separate microbiome for each healthy 80-year-old, presumably a response to the selective needs of your body for health in the gut. What we did when we looked at individuals who were unhealthy is we were able to show, one, they didn't lose the core taxa, and two, they totally failed to differentiate individually. And when we compared unhealthy 80-year-olds for a 4-year period with healthy 80-year-olds by these criteria, the unhealthy were 4 times as likely to die across that four-year period. So isn't it going to be wonderful when we can begin to manipulate the gut microbiome to optimize aging, as we've talked about here? So the science of wellness and prevention, then you really can begin to understand. And the Million Person Project is going to do 2 important things. It'll demonstrate the power unequivocally and statistically of all the things I've talked about. But 2, it's also going to let us document cost savings, okay? So the scientific wellness, optimize body and brain health, optimize aging, optimize cognitive health and so forth, understanding, optimizing the gut microbiome health, the gut brain and so forth, and integrating all of those together. And for prevention, of course, looking at the polygenic scores and acting according to high or low risk, different approaches to the use of cholesterol for high-risk people. You can bring down for LDL cholesterol high risk, you can bring down LDL cholesterol in high-risk people only with statins, and with low-risk people, you can do it with diet and exercise. But of course, the key thing is the transitions. And we estimate for 1 million people over 10 years, we'll see 250,000 transitions. We'll have biomarkers absolutely nailed for every kind of transition. We'll have deep insights into mechanisms for reversal of transition and so forth. And the same will be true for prevention of digital health. These digital metrics give us really early prediction for depression in a beautiful way, well before the onset of actual depression. So you can start thinking about a whole variety of different things. And of course, we're going to have lots of actionable possibilities here. 14 different papers, whatever it is, you could read through them. We'll leave the slides with you. Phenome Health, the partnerships that I talked about that are critical are one, Guardian Research Network, which is a network that caps a whole series of healthcare systems that collectively have about 140 hospitals. They have about 130 million patients. And what Guardian Research Network has done is, one, consent all those patients so they're ready for research projects like the Million Person Project. Number 2, they figured out how to beautifully extract electronic health records, obtaining both structured data, clinical chemistries and stuff, and unstructured data, doctor's notes and path reports and all of those kind of things. And it's utterly the most beautiful electronic health data we've ever seen. So they have 30 million of those that we can review, and I'll tell you why that's important. And then finally, they're present in 13 states in the South and Southeast. They lie across major African populations and major Latino populations. And this means we have the possibility of recruiting racial diversity in accordance with population ratios in the American population. And we're committed to doing that. So the second partner is positive for brain health. And I've described that. The third partner is a company called Technicity, which has software, which has hardware engineers that together with our data people have built a whole series of computational platforms that let us handle all the aspects of consenting and education of patients, of the acquisition of samples, of the generation and accumulation of data, and finally its placement and standardization and analysis in the cloud. And the data platform is agnostic with regard to cloud types. It's modular, so we can give partners different subunits of what they think they need. It's going to be a very, very powerful system, totally unique. ISB, we're going to use a lot of technologies that have been developed there, including knowledge graphs and digital twins, and I'll say a word about those kinds of things later on. And Bioanalytica is a company that'll generate data for us. They spun off from ISB to generate genome and phenome data. Deloitte is a company that's helping us get partners from across the healthcare spectrum. And Google we're collaborating with regard to search, with regard to cloud, with regard to digital health. And we hope we can persuade DeepMind to collaborate with hyperscale AI. And again, we'll say more about that. We've explored federal partnerships with NIH and all of us, DOE and the VA, and there's enthusiasm on all parts. We've essentially have outstanding advisory board. I'll show you in just a moment. And we've done a lot of lobbying, and I presented to Congress in December, and it was really well received. Now, between polarization and the war, God knows when this is going to happen, but it'll happen sometime. And finally, we've gotten the healthcare system to agree to use the science of wellness and prevention in the context of family practitioners. And it would be something we'd love to get your medical school thinking about too in that same kind of context. So I'll assign you that as a job, David. So look at that. Yeah. Oh, that's right. We have an official here. So anyway, we can talk more about that kind of thing. Now, this is my scientific advisory board, and let me just say they're utterly spectacular. I could tell you all about them. And this is spectacular data. So this is a plot of individuals from 4 different races that on the far right are homozygous for ApoE4, the largest causative gene for Alzheimer's in Caucasians. And you can see that we have a risk that's equivalent, if you have both copies, to a 60% chance of getting Alzheimer's when you're 60 years of age, okay? It's a staggering risk. If you look at the Japanese, their risk is 3 to 4 times greater than our risk is. And if you look at the Hispanic population, homozygotes don't even matter. So tell me that diversity isn't utterly key in being able to treat people. And I'll give you one more level of sophistication, okay? In the future, we're not going to have pure races. We're all going to be hybrids. So we're developing programs now where we can take your genome and we can tell you which portions of your genomes come from where, and we can make the correlations with the appropriate disease gene. And that's going to be absolutely critical because our population is going to become more and more hybrid. So implementation, where are we now? We're actually adding to the Million Person Project, this whole brain health that we've talked about. We're adding electronic health records, which we've talked about, and we're adding social determinants of health and patient-reported outcomes, and we're adding an enormous amount of data from the blood. And I'm not going to go into it, but it's going to be an enormously comprehensive thing. And let me tell you that one complete genome is what, about 120 gigabytes of information. One complete immune analysis of 5,000 cells is probably 200 gigabytes of information. And if you do that 20 times across, you can begin to see the kind of data you have to be able to deal with. And our platform can deal with that kind of data. It's really essential. So What we have then are a series of partners. So Guardian Research Network gives us access to patients, and we have the ability through the computational platform to collect the samples and send them out for the various types of analyses that are listed there. And these are some of the vendors and so forth. And of course, the central part of this whole thing is this data platform that I've talked about that can generate information for patients, information for intellectual property, information for companies, you name it. And so I think this is essentially going to create, as I said earlier, the infrastructure that everyone will be able to use to spread this once the trial period has been demonstrated. And what we are going to do, as I said earlier, is collaborate with pharma to set up special high data approaches to two diseases, long COVID-19 and diabetes. And all those things are planned. And we have a partner that we think is going to be paying us to get started within the next month or so. We're talking with a lot of groups across the world, the British Biobank. There is a new UK program called Your Future Health, and it's a 5 million person project, but it's all genomes again. I've talked to both of the directors there, trying to persuade them they got to get into phenomics. Singapore, we've done the same thing, and of course, all of us is primarily a genomic program as well. But there are lots of things that we can give to these people, and I'm not going to go through and run about them here. But one of the things we're proposing for them is we create an international cloud where all of the relevant governments have access to determine what the constraint should be for the appropriate adjudication of de-identified data, making it accessible across the world and so forth. And Google is really excited about this possibility. Now, I think the one group that is really going to fight this is China. And that's a really interesting discussion, which we can get into if we want to. So, powerful computational approaches. We built the platform. It's great on multidimensional data integration. We're going to use knowledge graphs with 50 million edges. We're going to use digital twins that have the integration of physiologic and biochemical data. We've done it for Alzheimer's, and we're doing it for diabetes and AML now. And we're going to be able then to, together with Google, hopefully to put it into hyperscale AI. And it will set the constraints for this hyperscale AI, which is just the kind of AI you've heard about, but multiply it by 1 billion-fold in its computational abilities, okay? So you can make correlations with the right kind of education on individual patient data. And this is gonna absolutely transform what we can do in patient healthcare and actionable possibilities. So let me just say that this P4 vision that we've talked about with wellness and disease, it's the fourth P that is by far the hardest, because the first 3 P really are all about science, and the fourth P is about sociology and psychology and education and so forth. And here's an example of the educational programs we're creating here, and I'm just going to list them, and we can talk about them afterwards if you'd like to. Well, I have a textbook that's just being sent to the publisher on systems and on P4 medicine and so forth. I've just written a popular book on what 21st century medicine should be from Harvard University Press that, again, is just going to press. We're making a 90-minute documentary film on 5,000 years of wellness, and it's called The Phenome Age, A Quest for Wellness. We have this incredible Italian producer who knows how to make films beautifully. And if we had time, I could show you a snippet of one of them. And then we've got a partnership with Scientific American where they're going to have a special issue on wellness, 80 pages, leading people in the areas of wellness, discussing how wellness is going to transform healthcare in the future. And we're setting up meetings and podcasts, and I'm writing a major article for Scientific American on the science of wellness and prevention. But what all of this, of course, is going to do in thinking about people from birth to death is it's really going to add an extra 30 years to the dimension of our life. And of course, the question is, what are you going to actually do with that extra 30 years? And how do we encourage people to optimize their wellness so they can really make useful care of it and so forth? And if you think about the things that are important to human beings, education and jobs and retirement and wellness and interactions, family, those kind of things. What is fundamental to all of them is wellness. You can't experience those things, creativity, without basically being well. And there is a terrific book called The 100-Year Life that discusses in absolutely a beautiful way the challenges as well as the opportunities, but it misses completely the importance of wellness. It's absolutely an astounding deletion in a book that really is quite good. I really argue that you ought to read it in the future. But it does tie in kind of with my own philosophy. If you look at the trajectory of ordinary scientific careers, they're really bell-shaped for most people. They go up to a maximum, they kind of fade away as they get older, right? But the way you can avoid that is if you get near the maximum, if you change your career, you reactivate yourself, you get excited, you get turned on, you get thinking about, and you're a little terrified that you're way behind on everything. And if you keep doing that, you can keep going up. And I think that's the key to using this extra 30 years of life. It's being engaged and committed and enthusiastic. And I encourage all of you, after 10 or 15 years, it's time to start doing, and I'm not saying you have to change careers totally, but you have to change orientations where you have to learn major new things. So what are we going to deliver in the way of actionable things? Infrastructure, a data ecosystem, a biobank, the computational platforms, the actionable possibilities, the ability to do new hyperscale AI using all sorts of new constraints, and the ability to deal with equity, equality, and inclusion, and a network of academic and industrial partners to explore the data in new different kinds of dimensions. And of course, the bottom vision is this, bottom line vision is we want to keep people well. We want to be able to make transitions. We want to give you that extra 20 or 30 years of life, and you better get ready for it now. So what I will argue is this beyond the human genome is really going to solve the 5 major problems of contemporary healthcare. That's quality, the aging population, the explosion of chronic diseases, cost, and diversity, equity, and inclusion. We could go through all of those and talk about how we're going to do it. But that's probably too long, but it's time to do whatever David thinks we should do next. Yeah.
What we should do is I should look at everyone threateningly with this mic. Any questions? I'm not good at threatening. don't know if I need the microphone. Well, if you do it this way, everyone online. Oh, right. Yeah.
Oh, I've got my microphone. Oh, I have to stand over here, don't I?
So
Yes.
I was curious about at the end, you got to it at the participatory part, but this return of results. So you have, you're obviously generating a ton of data. But I'm wondering about that part, like how do you return results to patients, to clinicians in a form that they can actually use? Is that the AI component that you're talking
Yeah.
about?
It will end up being. The way we returned it with Aerovale was we used coaches that deliver the actionable possibilities that came out of our analysis of the data. And essentially, it's going to be that way. And in the beginning, you can have navigators or coaches that could return it. Physicians probably aren't going to be able to get into the detail, but ultimately, I'll guarantee you the solution is out of ours, is to be able to have your own personalized health device that can interpret the data and encourage you, like your mom, to behave in an appropriate way to be healthy and wealthy and wise. So, and we've talked with Amazon about this, and Amazon wants things that can be done immediately, and they see that as too long-term a problem. But Google actually is willing to think about it, so we'll see where that goes. But in the end, coaches don't scale. There's a coach. If a coach is superb, she can handle a few hundred people, and that isn't going to scale any way, shape, or form. And somebody's going to make a lot of money. So I hope we find someone who will really dive in, do this. And Jeff Wilkie, who was #2 at Amazon for a long time, and he's actually chair of our board now, he's argued that the time is not right for avatars that are that sophisticated. It'll be another 5 years before we can do it. But he said then almost certainly we're going to be able to do it. So.
Thank you, Dr. Hood. That was mind-blowing. I took notes. I was wondering, how can I become one of those 10 million people?
1 million people.
Oh, sorry, 1 million.
It's 10 times better than you thought. Well, what I'm doing is taking names of people who really would like to get into this, so that when we get a program that is distributed that can do these things, we can bring in anybody who wants to. And one of the first things we're going to do is to be able to handle this in a distributed manner, because I probably have 120 people on this list that they're really enthusiastic, and as soon as it's possible. So if you're interested, David can give you my email. Gosh, I better get an email, Phenome Health, so I don't have to respond to all of these things. But that's what I'd suggest. The other possibility is if Calgary Medical School really gets serious about collaborating with us, that could happen much sooner. So maybe you can put pressure on the dean to actually get involved. I mean, is that permissible to say? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Sounds like it could be a really fun project.
Online.
Okay, let's invite the online question.
I suspect I'm probably the voice of God over the speaker system, but
Yep, you are. Yep.
I was wondering if you could address, kind of given the timelines for development and the substantial cost associated with generating all of the systems and processes to be able to make something like this possible, and kind of the obvious massive quantity of intellectual property that would come off of this. How, after it's developed, would one avoid kind of the entire system being acquired by a mega corporation, and kind of the system being driven by kind of return on capital investment rather than return on investment for human health?
All I can say is all the mega systems I know of right now couldn't be less interested in this endeavor. Now, if it's more successful in the future, I think they could get more interested, but we're setting it up with the infrastructure to make it distributive. So we don't see, and you know, there are a lot of things we're not going to patent that I think will make common property, common access out there to be able to do things. Now, I'm not going to say we aren't going to try and start up companies with particular kinds of opportunities. And frankly, in the beginning, those opportunities were virtually all deal with disease, because that's where the current healthcare system is. But I'm saying you know, what was remarkable about the Human Genome Project is all of the data were available to anyone, okay? And we plan to make that. If the government puts in the $10 million, the constraint will be absolutely free and open access, and that's exactly where I want to go. I mean, if we were going to do it differently, I would have made Phenome Health a for-profit company, and I could have done that easily. But if I did that, I don't think the government would put the money in to start the big project, frankly. So, I mean, that's a non-starter. But I think it's very important to get data out and let many, many people look at data this complex. I mean, I think 100 groups could look at it and we'd still find new things once we get the multidimensionality of this data. I mean, look, it's genome, it's blood analytes of many different types, it's the gut microbiome, it's brain health, it's digital health, and that's going to be, I mean, digital health, you're talking about epibytes, you know, when you start thinking about continuous information and everything. So, so anyway, I think it's very important that, and it's important that people like you move in a direction where the attitude is, let's bring it to everybody and not let's make money out of it. And I'm not knocking the people that are in the entrepreneurial group, because I think it's important that the entrepreneurial group bring back money that can fuel the rest of us to do all of the broader kinds of things that are important. That's really important. So
Just kind of as a follow-up comment, sorry if I may. The Human Genome Project, I think, was made publicly available through an action of the Clinton administration through an executive order. I think the Venter Foundation was originally intended, I wasn't around at the time, but originally intended to have significant intellectual property over the human genome. So kind of the question stems particularly from that of kind of, I'm reassured that you've structured it as a nonprofit and kind of the intention is to make it publicly available, but there's a version of our current state where the human genome was covered with intellectual property and no one was able to access it. So anyways, thank you. Excellent talk.
yeah, well, I will say one thing. The decision to make the first human genome possible was a very famous meeting held at Marcos Island, where there was an enormous argument and debate with all the major funders there. And the unanimous conclusion was it would be public. And everyone agreed to it. And I suspect the same kind of thing will end up happening here too. And what I'm trying to do right now is I've sent letters out to the 5 or 6 people in the world that I think are leaders in precision medicine, trying to argue that they should join in with us and help direct and make sure this is done in the right way. And we'll see how that goes. Some of them are direct competitors of what we do, but I said, look, I mean, there's so much to do. We don't have to worry about competing with one another for sure.
To be fair, Craig Ventnor's company did go bankrupt too. Just I'll put that out there. But
well, so did Airville.
well,
So, but I would say of the 17 companies I've started, Airville has been the most successful, because it is the one that had the biggest paradigm change waiting to be realized, but it is going to be realized. So, yeah. See, what's great about Beyond the Human Genome is after 10 years, my prediction is the cost of phenomics, which is prohibitive now, will go down 2 to 3 orders of magnitude. And once that happens, every payer is going to say, it's obvious we should do this kind of thing. And that's what happened with the genome too. Genome went down 7 orders of magnitude and still going down, frankly.
If I don't know if anyone can hear me, I just have a question I'd like to ask.
Sure.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you for the presentation, Dr. Hood. I'm very sort of excited to see that you've been able to bring together so many separate sort of groups on one project. It really seems very promising. I want to sort of follow up with following on Bradley's question about the flip side of it, I guess, since you've got the phenome, you've got the genome, and you can provide these wellness recommendations. But do you anticipate that there would be challenges for individuals to be able to follow these recommendations, especially if those recommendations are perhaps not as affordable for them? I know sometimes with traditional wellness, for example, where people say you have to have a good diet, people bring up the concept of food deserts, which is, well, you're in the inner city, you can't afford the greens, you can't access the greens easily, that kind of thing.
So the answer in the immediate range is that is a problem, no question. But in the slightly broader range, once the payers realize how dramatic the savings are going to be with good health, the government is going to be focused on making the elements of good health available to all. And that would include diet is one of the really big ones that I think is the hardest one. I mean, exercise, I mean, sleep, those kinds of things, even stress. I think those are things that we can deal with without help. But diet is a tough one, and we will need help. And that's why it's so important to have this demonstration project that I think that savings are going to be orders of magnitude greater than anyone could imagine. Okay. So, I mean, let me just give you one example. In the US today, we spend $600 billion a year on drugs, okay? If you take the 10 top selling drugs in the US today, we find that less than 10% of the people respond. What will come out of Beyond the Human Genome Project are biomarkers to identify the responders for all the major drugs, okay? So suppose we can just focus on the 10% where it's going to work, and we save 90% of 600 billion. That's simple. Of course, one of the problems you're going to have is pharma is going to go ballistic at that. And that's a real issue that you have to deal with. But that is going to come. Or another example that I love, because I know a lot about this. In the US today, Alzheimer's costs about 600 billion a year, okay? Roughly half of that is for caretakers' loss in salary and loss in savings and taking care for the Alzheimer's patient. And the other half is the treatment of the Alzheimer's patient with totally, absolutely inadequate kind of drugs. It's absolutely a crime. So what's going to happen with our ability when we can call Alzheimer's 10 years before the clinical diagnosis, and we can put a multimodal approach to reversing it before you ever get there, and we can ensure those individuals never go there. That's what's going to really come in the future. So all of a sudden you've wiped out another 600 billion a year. So, and look, that's just about 2 things. It's about drugs and it's about one disease. And if you get diabetes, you get cardiovascular, you get these other things. Numbers are even greater than Alzheimer's. So.
Thank you so much. It's good to hear that this has sort of been considered, and I really hope your vision comes to fruition.
Oh, it will. It's all a question of, will I be alive when it comes?
Well, you got another 40 or 50 years, I think, right? That's it.
I do.
Yeah.
I do. I'm getting younger.
All right, one more question here.
Such a great talk, Dr. Hood. Thank you so much. My question is about the trajectory of the technology and some of the challenges that might arise from the technology far outweighing some of the education pieces that are necessary for some of the participatory interactions with our patients and with our populations. So I know you've addressed some of the education, but do you anticipate that being an issue kind of going forward, that we can have technology from our EMRs and integrate like avatars and things like that for patients? But if the health literacy and the genetic literacy isn't there in the populations for them to be able to actually take advantage of that.
So you're saying in the underserved, the underdeveloped countries, how do we manage that?
Yeah.
It fundamentally is going to be education. And I think the first kind of education will be showing them that in the developed world, the kind of savings you can get if you do healthcare in the right way will push them along those directions, because they'll save enormous amounts of money, just like the developed nations will. But I think we have to have really good, strong proof of principle in populations where we can convince them to carry this out. Then we can create an infrastructure that we can bring to the developing nations, and probably through companies that can ally with single payer systems, if that's what the countries have to do this kind of thing. But again, I think it is getting missionaries from the countries themselves engaged in the developed world projections, and then being able to take that vision back to their country. That's going to be really key.
Okay, thanks so much, Dr. Hood. Let's say thanks one more time.
Okay.
And I know that we are over time. So we did have a set of questions that we had hoped we might discuss. I recognize, though, that it's coming on 7:45. So if you would like to take a stab at discussing and filling these out, please feel free, and then you can just leave them. We're kind of on our own mission to collect data from you in this sense. So we will gather anything you leave, but otherwise, yeah, thank you all so much for joining us tonight. It's great to see everyone's faces in person and online too. I'm not forgetting about you. All right, thank you so much.